Chapter 4. Now it is the time of night, that the graves all gaping wide, everyone lets forth his sprite in the churchway path to glide. Shakespeare, Midsummer Night's Dream. On the next night, about the same hours before, Dorothy came to Emily's chamber with the keys of that suite of rooms which had been particularly appropriated to the late Marchioness. These extended along the north side of the chateau, forming part of the old building, and as Emily's room was in the south, they had to pass over a great extent of the castle and by the chambers of several family, whose observations Dorothy was anxious to avoid, since it might incite inquiry and raise reports, such as would displease the Count. She therefore requested that Emily would wait half an hour before they ventured forth, and that they might be certain all the servants were gone to bed. It was nearly 1 before the chateau was perfectly still, or Dorothy thought it prudent to leave the chamber. In this interval, her spirits seemed to be greatly affected by the remembrance of past events, and by the prospect of entering again upon places where these had occurred, and in which she had not been for so many years. Emily was too affected, but her feelings had more of solemnity and less of fear. From the silence into which reflection and expectation had thrown them, they at length roused themselves and left the chamber. Dorothy at first carried the lamp, but her hand trembled so much with infirmity and alarm that Emily took it from her and offered her arm to support her feeble steps. They had to descend the great staircase, and after passing over a wide extent of the chateau, to ascend another, which led to the suite of rooms they were in quest of. They stepped cautiously along the open corridor that ran round the great hall, and into which the chambers of the Count, Countess, and Lady Blanche opened, and from thence, descending the chief staircase, they crossed the hall itself. Proceeding through the servants' hall, where the dying embers of a wood fire still glimmered on the hearth, and that supper table was surrounded by chairs that obstructed their passage, they came to the foot of the back of the staircase. Old Dorothy here paused and looked around. "Let us listen," said she, "if anything is stirring. Mademoiselle, do you hear any voice?" "None," said Emily. "There certainly is no person up in the chateau besides ourselves." "No, mademoiselle," said Dorothy, "but I have never been here at this hour before, and after what I know, my fears are not wonderful." "What do you know?" said Emily. "Oh, mademoiselle, we have no time for talking now. Let us go on. That door on the left is the one we must open." They proceeded, and having reached the top of the staircase, Dorothy applied the key to the lock. "Ah," she said, as she endeavored to turn it, "so many years have passed since this was opened, and I fear it will not move." Emily was more successful, and they presently entered a spacious and ancient chamber. "Alas!" exclaimed Dorothy as she entered, "the last time I passed through this door, I followed my poor lady's corpse." Emily, struck with the circumstance and affected by the dusky and solemn air of the apartment, remained silent, and they passed on through a long suite of rooms till they came to one more spacious than the rest and rich in the remains of faded magnificence. "Let us rest here for a while, madame," said Dorothy faintly. "We are going into the chamber where my lady died. That door opens into it." "Ah, mademoiselle, why did you persuade me to come?" Emily drew one of the massy armchairs with which the apartment was furnished and begged Dorothy would sit down and try to compose her spirits. "How the sight of this place brings all that passed formerly to my mind," said Dorothy. "It seems as if it was but yesterday since all that sad affair happened." "Hark, what noise is that?" said Emily. Dorothy, half starting from her chair, looked round the apartment, and they listened, but everything remained still. The old woman spoke again upon the subject of her sorrow. "This saloon, mademoiselle, was in my lady's time the finest apartment in the chateau, and it was fitted up according to her own taste. All this grand furniture, but you can now hardly see what it is for the dust, and our light is none of the best. Ah, how I have seen this room lighted up in my lady's time! All this grand furniture came from Paris, and was made after the fashion of some in the Louvre there, except those large glasses, and they came from some outlandish place, and that rich tapestry. How the colors are faded already since I saw it last." "I understood that was 20 years ago," observed Emily. "Thereabout, madam," said Dorothy, "and well remembered, but all the time between then and now seems as nothing. That tapestry used to be greatly admired at. It tells the stories out of some famous book or another, but I've forgotten the name." Emily now rose to examine the figures it exhibited, and discovered by the verses in the provincial tongue wrought underneath each scene that it exhibited stories from some of the most celebrated ancient romances. Dorothy's spirits being now more composed, she rose and unlocked the door that led into the late Marchioness's apartment, and Emily passed into the lofty chamber hung round with dark arras, so spacious that the lamp she held up did not shew its extent, while Dorothy, when she entered, had dropped into a chair, while sighing deeply she scarcely trusted herself with the view of a scene so affecting to her. It was some time before Emily perceived through the dusk the bed on which the Marchioness was said to have died, when, advancing to the upper end of the room, she discovered the high, canopied tester of a dark green damask, with the curtains descending to the floor in the fashion of a tent, half drawn and remaining apparently as they had been left 20 years before, and over the whole bedding was thrown a counterpane or pall of black velvet that hung down to the floor. Emily shuddered as she hung the lamp over it and looked within the dark curtains, where she almost expected to have seen a human face, and suddenly remembered the horror she had suffered upon discovering the dying Madame Montoni in the turret chamber of Udolpho. Her spirits fainted, and she was turning from the bed when Dorothy, who had now reached it, exclaimed, "Holy Virgin, methinks I see my lady stretched upon that pall, as when I last saw her." Emily, shocked by this exclamation, looked involuntarily again within the curtains, but the blackness of the pall only appeared while Dorothy was compelled to support herself upon the side of the bed, and presently tears brought her some relief. "Ah," she said as she had wept a while, "it was here I sat on that terrible night and held my lady's hand and heard her last words and saw all of her sufferings. Here she died in my arms." "Do not indulge these painful recollections," said Emily. "Let us go. Show me the picture you mentioned, if it will not too much affect you." "It hangs in the oriel," said Dorothy, rising and going towards a small door near the bed's head, which she opened, and Emily followed with the light into the closet of the late Marchioness. "Alas, there she is, mademoiselle," said Dorothy, pointing to a portrait of the lady. "There is her very self, just as she looked when she first came to the chateau. You see, madame, she was blooming like you then, and so soon to be cut off." When Dorothy spoke, Emily was attentively examining the picture, which bore a strong resemblance to the miniature, though the expression of the countenance in each was somewhat different, but still she thought she perceived something of that pensive melancholy in the portrait which so strongly characterized the miniature. "Pray, mademoiselle, stand beside the picture that I may look at you together," said Dorothy, who, when the request was complied with, exclaimed again the resemblance. Emily also, as she gazed upon it, thought that she had somewhere seen a person very like it, though she could not now recollect who this was. In this closet were many memorials of the departed Marchioness. A robe and several articles of her dress were scattered upon the chairs, as if they had been on the dressing table, a pair of gloves and a long black veil, which, as Emily took it up to examine, she perceived was dropping to pieces with age. "Ah," Dorothy said, observing the veil, "my lady's hand laid it there. It has never been moved since." Emily, shuddering immediately, laid it down again. "I remember seeing her take it off," continued Dorothy. "It was on the night before her death, when she returned from a little walk. I had persuaded her to take in the gardens, and she seemed refreshed by it. I told her how much better she looked, and I remember what a languid smile she gave me. But alas, she thought, or I either, that she was going to die that night." Dorothy wept again, and then, taking up the veil, threw it suddenly over Emily, who shuddered to find it wrapped round her, descending even to her feet, as she endeavored to throw it off. Dorothy entreated that she would keep it on for one moment. "I thought," added she, "how like you would look to my dear mistress in that veil. May your life, mademoiselle, be a happier one than hers." Emily, having disengaged herself from the veil, laid it again on the dressing table and surveyed the closet, where every object on which her eye fixed stood: a table with a silver crucifix, and a prayer book open, and Emily remembered with emotion what Dorothy had mentioned concerning her custom of playing on her lute in this window before she observed the lute itself lying on the corner of the table as if it had been carelessly placed there by the hand that had so often awakened it. "This is a sad, forlorn place," said Dorothy, "for when my lady died, I had no heart to put it to rights, or the chamber either, and my lord never came into the rooms after, so they remained just as they did when my lady was removed for interment." While Dorothy spoke, Emily was still looking on the lute, which was a Spanish one and remarkably large, and then, with a hesitating hand, she took it up and passed her fingers over the chords. They were out of tune, but uttered a deep and full sound. Dorothy started at their well-known tones, and seeing the lute in Emily's hand, said, "This is the lute my lady Marchioness loves so. I remember when last she played upon it. It was the night that she died. I came as usual to undress her, and as I entered the bedchamber, I heard the sound of music from the oriel, and perceiving it was my lady who was sitting there, I stepped softly to the door, which stood a little open, to listen for the music, though it was mournful, was so sweet. There I saw her with the lute in her hand, looking upwards, and the tears fell upon her cheeks, while she sung a vesper hymn, so soft and so solemn, and her voice trembled as it were, and then she would stop for a moment and wipe away her tears, and go on again lower than before. Oh, I had often listened to my lady, but never heard anything so sweet as this, and it made me cry almost to hear it."